Sarah, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making another video in my medical school application series. This time I'm going to be talking about letters of recommendation. I get so many questions from my students about letters of recommendation, ranging from who should I ask, how many letters do I need, what kinds of things should these writers even be talking about. And hopefully through this video, I'll be able to answer a lot of the questions you have about this part of the application process. All right, so the first topic I'll talk a bit about is how to actually choose your letter writers. You've probably been in college for at least 3 years. You probably have a ton of professors. You've probably done some research. So you probably have a pretty large selection of people from which to choose. AMCAS helps to narrow it down a little bit because they give either some suggestions or requirements about who should be writing your letters. First, they state that at least 2 science professors who have given you grades should write letters, and at least 1 non-science professor who has given you a grade should write you a letter. They also suggest that you have between 3 to 6 letters of recommendation. So those 3 professors could be all the letters of recommendation that you offer. However, I like to recommend to my students that they submit 4 to 5 letters, because hopefully they have 1 or 2 other people who might be able to also speak about their accomplishments, their abilities, or just them as a person, their personality. In addition to the science and non-science requirement and the sort of 3 to 6 letter range, it's also recommended that most, if not all, of your letter writers carry either PhD or MD degrees. This is primarily because medical schools value letters written from people who are MDs or PhDs more than they do people who only have a bachelor's degree or sometimes even no degree at all. And so I don't recommend you asking TAs, teaching fellows, people who maybe were part of your education but didn't carry that MD or PhD designation. Maybe if you have 1 of the 4 or 5, that's okay, but if at all possible, I would ensure that all your letter writers have that kind of degree. And then finally, I get students who say, I have lots of these letter writers who are wonderful. I know them all so well. I have so many science professors. How do I choose between them? Let's say they fit all the requirements I just listed. My final recommendation with respect to that is only choose letter writers that either have witnessed you having exceptional academic ability. This would involve getting all A's in their classes, maybe a few A minuses, and really just performing well academically. Maybe these are professors who have seen you be really creative or have really great critical thinking skills. Or professors who maybe have seen you in a leadership position. Maybe it's a faculty member who helps you co-lead a club. Someone basically who has just seen you excel in some area that would be relevant to medical school, because they're going to be able to reference that and talk about that in their letters, and that's going to reflect well on you guys as applicants. I also have students ask me, how do I get to know these professors? I go to a huge state school and all my science classes are gigantic. How am I ever supposed to get to know a professor? And it can be really tough. I think that students who go to really small schools have an advantage in this area just because it's so much easier to get to know professors and faculty members. But if you do go to a large state school and you're really struggling to form any sort of bond or relationship with your professors, I encourage you to use office hours as a time to get to know them a little more. And this doesn't mean just going to office hours and showing your face and maybe saying, hi, great lecture today. But this means going to office hours, hopefully when the professor's not super busy, maybe bringing questions that are beyond the scope of the course, kind of helping him show that you're interested in what's being taught, and maybe you're thinking beyond what he or she has been teaching you. And then hopefully if you do that enough times, you'll be able to start to get to know the professor, they'll recognize you, they'll see that you are really interested in the content they're teaching, and that can develop a suitable relationship for writing a letter of recommendation. All right, so now let's say you have chosen your 4 to 5 letter writers and you are ready to go. Now you have to ask them, and that can be super tricky. As much as some people resist the idea, I highly, highly recommend that you approach your letter writers in person, if at all possible. Obviously, if you went to college in New York and now you are doing a study abroad program in South Africa, not a very feasible idea. But if you are able to ask your letter writers in person, it's going to make a much better impression, and it's also going to remind them of who you are and say, right, she's the girl that used to come every week to office hours, or he's the one who always answered questions and, really contributed to class. And so I'd ask them in person, and not just ask them if they'll write you a letter, but ask if they feel that they can write you a strong letter of recommendation. If they say no or hesitate, get out of there. You wouldn't really want that person to be representing you in your application. So make sure you ask them in person if at all possible, and make sure that you ask them if they can write a strong letter of recommendation. All right, so once your letter writers have hopefully agreed to write letters of recommendation, there are then a series of emails that I recommend that you send out. Email 1 will take place right after the conversation. So you'll go home that night after they agree to write you a letter, and you'll just send them an email and say, hey, Dr. Professor so-and-so, thank you so much for agreeing to write me a letter of recommendation for med school. I'll reach out in the coming weeks/months and give you additional content you need in order to write this letter. Thanks so much. Sincerely, your name. And then a little bit later, and I'm not going to go into super detail about the timeline here. I did that already in another video linked below about the whole med school timeline. But if you're asking your letter writers in about January or February, which is what I recommend, email 2 will then happen, I would say, about 4 to 6 weeks later. So according to my timeline, this would be end of February to end of March. And this is going to be the big content-heavy email. And I'll now kind of explain what things should be in that email. There are 4 things in email 2 that I suggest you add. The first is an instruction letter. This instruction letter is a 1-page PDF document that basically lists the things that your letter writer needs to make sure that they're doing when writing your letter of recommendation. The first thing in the instruction letter is an AAMC URL of a document that helps your letter writer know what guidelines they should adhere to when writing the letter, what sorts of things they should include, what medical schools are looking at. Even if you have a seasoned letter writer who's writing your letter, I always include this link just because I think it's a helpful refresher in case it's been a while since they've written a letter. I've actually included the AAMC link in the description box below. Feel free to check it out and send it to any of your letter writers. Number 2 in this information letter or packet is a statement saying that you have waived your rights to view the letter that your letter writer is writing. So it'll be something like the applicant has waived his or her rights to view this letter. And then finally, it's suggested that the letter is written on letterhead with the original signature of the writer. And so I like to include this little information sheet of those 3 main things, just that the letter writer adheres to the correct rules. The second thing in this overall information dump of an email is your resume. So I suggest that all of my students send resumes out in this email. And even if you know your letter writer really well, I think a resume is a very concise and polished way to show off all the things you've accomplished, been involved in throughout your college experience. And so your professor might know you really well in one arena of life, but they might not know what you do in all of your free time after class is over. And so I find that including a resume just gives them a very broad overview of who you are as an applicant. And sometimes they'll throw in some additional stuff from that resume to sort of beef up your letter and make you sound a little more impressive. The third thing I recommend including in email 2 is a personal statement draft. Now, I know just hearing that might freak you guys out, and if you're following my timeline, you won't have a really solid draft until April anyway. However, if you have any semblance of a draft, if you have a 2-page document explaining why you like medical school, anything that can help the letter writer kind of understand your motivations for going to medical school, maybe life events that have happened that have inspired you to pursue this career path, anything that could help the writer better understand you and your motivations could help them make a stronger letter in support of you as a medical school applicant. And then last but not least, the 4th thing I suggest including in email number 2 is a deadline for when this letter is due. Some people will choose to just give a vague sense of when the letter writer should write their letter, so they'll be like, oh, in the next few months, or, maybe by June. I think the most helpful thing to do is give your letter writer a definitive date of when the letter should be due. And don't make this date the date that you plan to submit your application. So, if you're right on target and you're planning on submitting your AMCAS application on June 3rd or 4th or whenever it opens, you don't want to make your deadline for the letter that same day. Instead, I encourage you to kind of push it up about 2 weeks. And so I like to use May 15th as the deadline. When I was applying to med school, when I guide students to apply to med school, I always suggest using May 15th because it gives you enough wiggle room in case something goes wrong and you're not able to get the original letter that you expected, or perhaps your letter writer just forgot and now needs to hurry up and write one. And along with including a deadline, I also recommend that you include instructions for how to upload your letter. This will vary greatly school by school. Some schools encourage mailing in letters. Some schools have some paid or free letter upload systems. So check in with your own college or university to figure out the best way that your letter writers should submit those letters. And so as a recap, 4 things in email 4 should be that information instruction sheet, should be your resume, should be a draft of a personal statement or some kind of paragraph-like thing explaining why you want to go to medical school. And then finally, it should be a hard and fast deadline that you maybe bold or underline or just make it very clear that they know when you want this letter by. All right, so then now you can take a huge sigh of relief because for the next month or two, you're kind of off the hook. It's more just up to your letter writer to get things done from his or her end. But then once May rolls around, it's my encouragement to then send email number 3. This email doesn't have to be long at all, just something short and sweet that reminds your letter writer that the deadline is approaching. And then that might be all you need. You might not need any more emails. Hopefully everything just goes according to plan. Your letter writers are on top of their game and everything gets completed. But if not, this is when emails 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, etc. come into play. So, if you don't hear in response to that email number 3, you might want to send out another email perhaps a week later. Now it's like May 10th, 11th. Hey, just checking in again. Wanted to see how the letter's coming. And then if it's May 15th, you haven't heard anything, you might want to try to go in person to talk to this individual to see what's going on, or maybe just send some more follow-up emails. In my own experience, everyone that I've worked with have had letter writers that do in fact end up writing the letter, but sometimes they're not the best at adhering to that May 15th guideline that I recommend. And so don't be hesitant to check in with your letter writers. Don't be hesitant to kind of urge them, or maybe even nag them, if the deadline is approaching or has already passed. Because at the end of the day, if the professors agreed to write you a letter of recommendation, they probably do feel that you're a strong candidate, and they're probably more than happy to write a letter. A lot of times there's just many things they're juggling and they may forget. So nagging is not always the worst thing, especially in this case when your application is on the line. Now, let's say all your letters are in. Let's say you are done, that box is checked. The last thing that I recommend you do is send letters of thanks to all of your letter writers. Some people send emails, but I strongly encourage that you send handwritten letters, just thanking them for taking the time to write these letters. I guarantee you that the amount of time it will take to write a thank you letter is a whole heck of a lot of time less than it has taken them to write your letter of recommendation. I think that's just a great way of showing them how much you appreciate the time they put into writing your letter of recommendation. And I think that's all I have on the letter of recommendation topic. If you guys have any questions, if there's something that you're wondering about that I didn't cover in this video, please feel free to either comment below or send me an email. My email is listed in the description box below. As always, like this video, please subscribe to my channel for more tips and tricks about the medical school application process. And as always, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much.